Hey class, Mrs. Matheson here, and this is Unit 3, Notes 5 on isosceles and equilateral triangles. Our learning targets today is I can use properties of isosceles and equilateral triangles to find the missing side lengths and angle measures. So first we need to talk about some definitions. An isosceles triangle theorem states if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite of those sides are also congruent. So if we say side AC is congruent to side BC, as marked here with our congruence symbols, then we can say the angles opposite are also congruent. So angle 1 is also congruent to 2. So that's just saying that if the sides are congruent, the opposite angles are also congruent. We also have the converse, so the opposite. If the two angles of a triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite are also congruent. So if angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent, then DE is congruent to FE. So if our sides are congruent, our angles are congruent. If our angles are congruent, our sides are congruent. And that's talking about two of them. All right, so our first problem here says find PN. Well, we notice here and here that these angles are congruent, so the sides opposite of them will also be congruent. So if MN is 11 centimeters, then PN is 11 centimeters also. Number 2 here says find the value of Z. Again, we see that two of our angles are congruent, so the sides opposite are also congruent. So we're going to set that 2Z minus 15 equal to 9. Add 15 to both sides, and we get with 2Z equals 24. So our Z equals 12. Problem 3 is this proof, and we're actually going to do this proof in class together, so we'll hold off on that. So let's talk about some equilateral triangles. An equilateral triangle has each angle of equilateral triangle is 60 degrees. We've kind of talked about that because a triangle adds up to 180 degrees and it has three angles. And if all three of them are going to be equal, we're going to take 180 and divide it by 3. And a triangle is equilateral only if and only if it's equal angular. So if it's equilateral, it must be equal angular. So if angle A is congruent to angle B, and those are also congruent to angle C, then we can say AC side is congruent to BC side is congruent to the AB side. So if it's congruent sides, it's congruent angles. All right, so looking here at number 4, we see that one of the angles is 60. Now that does not guarantee that angle P and angle R are also 60. But what helps us with that is we have two sides here that are congruent, so we know their opposite angles are also congruent. So if we take 180 and minus 60, that tells us how much angle P and angle R together are. And so if we divide it by 2, because we have 120, that's angle P plus angle R. If we divide it by 2, that tells us each of those angles is 60 degrees. And if they're 60 degrees and angle Q is 60 degrees, then we know that all three sides are congruent, and therefore PR is also 5 centimeters. All right, so looking here at problem 5. Problem 5, we see that our two sides here and here are congruent. So that means our opposite angles are also congruent. But we also see that these angles are congruent. So that means that these sides that are opposite are also congruent. So we see two sets of congruent parts. So then that's going to tell us that all three of the angles are congruent and all three of the sides are congruent. So if all three angles are congruent, we can take our 4x minus 8 and set it equal to 60. And then our two y expressions can be set equal Go ahead and solve for my x and y now that I've set this up for you. Solve for x and y. All right, 6 says find the values of x and y. Again, we see that two angles are congruent, so opposing sides are congruent. But we also see two sides are congruent, so two opposite sides are going to be, or opposite angles are going to be congruent. So all three angles are congruent, all three sides are congruent. So I want you to set these up on your own for us. And then our last one, find the values of x and y. Notice here that our two sides are congruent. So our angles here and here are congruent, but we don't know anything about this missing angle here. So I want you to figure out, well, what's the measure for this angle? You can find the degree measure for that based on the information you're given. Don't forget to go on and take your Schoology quiz if you've been assigned one, and we will finish up those undone problems in class.